Okay, Brian, let me know when we're ready. Good morning. I'm Nestor Davidson, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the board. This is the fourth meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City with leases commencing on or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2024, and on or before September 30th, 2025. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Doug Apple?
Present.
Hennessis Aquino? Christina DeRose?
Present.
Rob Ehrlich?
Present.
Arpit Gupta?
Present.
Alex Schwartz? Christina Smith?
Present.
Adon Soltran?
Present.
Nestor Davidson, I'm present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. The next planned meeting of this board will be the preliminary vote for rent-stabilized lease adjustments, which will be this coming Tuesday, April 30th. This in-person meeting will start at 7 p.m. and will be held at the LaGuardia Performing Arts Center at LaGuardia Community College in Long Island City, Queens. Doors will open at 6 p.m. If you plan to attend, please use the entrance on Van Dam Street at the intersection of 47th Avenue. We encourage you to arrive early to avoid delays and help speed the entry of the public. The meeting will also be live streamed via YouTube. Information regarding this meeting will be posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB in our meetings section. We are planning 4 public hearings for the public to comment on the proposed guidelines. The hearings will be held in Queens on May 30th at the Jamaica Performing Arts Center, in the Bronx on June 3rd in the main theater at Hostos Community College, and in Manhattan on June 11th in Adler Hall at the New York Society for Ethical Culture, which is at West 64th and Central Park West. We will also have a hearing in Brooklyn at a date and venue we hope to finalize and announce shortly. If you are interested in receiving email updates about upcoming Rent Guidelines Board meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on RGB email updates under quick links. Proposed language for the apartment and hotel orders were emailed to board members yesterday, and there are copies of this proposed language in your meeting folder. You will also find in your folder 3 staff research memos. And again, a friendly reminder to members that the annual filing of the Conflicts of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report filing period began on April 8th and will end on May 3rd, a week from Friday. If you haven't already done so, please file before the deadline. We will begin today's meeting with our owner panel, which is scheduled to go to 12:15. The board will take a break from 12:15 to 1, and then in the afternoon we will hear testimony from the tenant panel from 1 to 3:30 p.m. Wonderful. All right, with that, let me welcome our owner group for testimony, and I'll let you introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Chair. Son, yes? Lights on. Can you hear me? You're picking me up? All right. Thank you, Chair. I guess we'll go around the panel first. My name is Joseph Condon. I'm here from Community Housing Improvement Program.
Hi, Kelly Farrell from the Rent Stabilization Association.
Reggie Thomas, the Real Estate Board of New York.
Good morning, Sharon Redhead, Sponey.
And I'm with Sponey also, and Korchak.
Thank you so much. Joe, please take us away.
Yes, so we're going to each give a little presentation. Hopefully, we'll try to save questions from you all until the end, until everybody's finished. But obviously, if there are questions, just points of clarification or something in between, that we're happy to answer those. Just wanted to make sure everybody has a chance to testify. Okay, let's start it. Again, my name is Joseph Condon. I appreciate being here today on behalf of CHIP. For those of you who don't know, CHIP is a membership organization of housing providers, owners and operators of rent-stabilized housing. Together, they represent roughly 400,000 units of rent-stabilized housing throughout the city. Collectively, they provide more affordable, below-market housing to the people of New York City than any other affordable housing program, including the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. It is important to note, and I always do this, that the properties owned and operated by CHIP members are all pre-1974 rent-stabilized housing. That means they don't receive tax benefits or other subsidies in exchange for being rent-stabilized and providing below-market rents. These housing providers have to account for all of the operating costs of an unregulated building, but without the subsidies that come along with the post-73 regulation buildings. So my testimony is really going to attempt to get this board to focus on the data that you have from the pre-1974 rent-stabilized buildings. We have seen over the years that the data presented can be skewed by inclusion of post-73 buildings or even pre-74 buildings that have high rates of free market units, especially in core Manhattan. Throughout the years, it has been the practice of this board to adopt rent adjustments at a lower rate than necessary to cover year-over-year operating expenses. But prior to 2019, the shortfalls of those guidelines were masked by other rent increases allowed under the system when a unit became vacant. Tenants in occupancy received below-market renewal increases, but the base rent for the unit was eventually permitted to be adjusted to a more reasonable level on vacancy. That is no longer permitted, and now that the RGB guideline is effectively the only rent increase permitted, we have seen NOI drop in these buildings, these pre-1974 buildings outside of the core Manhattan, consistently since 2019. And when when guidelines are adopted that are below what are required, buildings are being defunded, and there are no other ways to increase those revenues. Cost-to-income ratios are rising, and NOI is decreasing in these buildings in the outer boroughs. And since the RGB started looking at pre- and post-74 buildings by borough, we see that NOI decline significantly in certain areas. So if you look at the screen, that is a chart of NOI from 2019 forward. Each line represents a different borough. So you have Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Upper Manhattan, and then that purple line is the citywide without core Manhattan. And those are the NOI numbers from the RGB. If you look at the chart below, at that bottom line, the percent change since 2019, it will show you the percent changes in NOI for each of those boroughs for their pre-74 buildings. Obviously, the Bronx is a significant concern at down 21% of NOI since 2019. Upper Manhattan, also a significant concern at down 19% since 2019. But Brooklyn and Queens, down 8.5%. Obviously, that's not as severe as the other boroughs, but that's also concerning. Anytime NOI drops, that causes distress on the building. And as NOI continues to drop year over year and it becomes a trend, it has negative consequences down the road. Now, if we look at a quick review of the one-year commensurate adjustments from the RGB compared to, it's the CPI adjusted commensurate that we're using because that's the only one that accounts for inflation. So if we look at those guidelines, there it is. So if we look at the one-year guidelines adopted by the board compared to the one-year CPI commensurate over time, so on that graph, the blue bar is the one-year guideline adopted. The orange bar is the CPI commensurate. And as you can see, over time, the commensurate is clearly outpacing what's adopted by this board. And as you could see from the prior slide, that's having negative impacts on NOI consistently in all of these outer borough buildings that are pre-74 stabilized. So we really think the board,
Joe, can I ask just a quick
Yeah.
question? The 525 to 200, can you just explain the y-axis there, the numbers?
that's just the way Excel put them out there.
Okay.
You know, there's no rhyme or reason. I mean, it could be set to 0, but
Okay.
that's average NOI per unit.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And that's taken from the appendices, the tables that the RGB has put out. So if you look at at each of those years, you'll see those are the numbers for that borough and that category of building. No, 2020 was the first year, or 2022 in this calendar year, but 2022 broke down pre and post 74 for the year 2020. That it was in the I&E special memo, right? And so since that, happy to answer any other questions on where the data comes from, but those are the RGB numbers. We're just taking them from you, and that's what they're showing. So you know, we really think it's important for the board to focus on this and not be distracted by the 10% NOI increase from basically core Manhattan properties that went up 46% this year. Core Manhattan went up 46% in NOI. Last year they were down 21%. So clearly those buildings have the flexibility and the ability to recover from downturns that the pre-1974 buildings in the outer boroughs do not have. They do not have that flexibility. They only have what this board provides them, and what this board has provided them over the last couple of years is leading to what you see on the chart right there. There's another chart I have. Oh, first, just a housekeeping. I did not include the charts in the testimony. I did send them electronically, but you don't have them in front of you. Apologies for that. So yes, so this one that's up on the screen entitled Rent Growth. This tracks the rent of a unit from 2013 using both the RGB adopted guidelines and the CPI adjusted commensurate guidelines over time. And what you can see, and it mirrors sort of what we saw in this chart, you know, those 2 years in 2015 and 2016 where the commensurate was actually negative, helped a little, but over time that gap continues to grow between what the commensurate adjustment says that rent should be and what the rent actually is based on the 1-year guidelines. So I used 11 years or 10 years because that's roughly the average rent stabilized length of a rent stabilized tenancy, according to IBL from a report they issued a couple of years ago.
So Joe, just to make sure I'm understanding this, this is what the rent would be under the 1-year guideline, average rent?
So
Versus what it would be under the commensurate?
the blue line is what so it's starting from 1038 rent, which was the median rent outside of the core Manhattan in 2013.
So now it's 1180.
So now it's right. So now it's 1180. That's if you're following the 1-year guideline from that point, you end up at 1180. If you follow the commensurate from that point, you end up at 1345.
And does the vacancy adjustment do?
I'm sorry.
It says adjusted with vacancy. What's that?
Oh, that's a relic. I'm sorry, because I'm using some of the older commensurates. The RGB actually used to come up with 2 commensurate adjustments. One was using the blend of vacancy versus renewal leases that occurred, and one was not. So that we used the CPI with the vacancy blend for those prior years.
So yeah, so the one Joe is using,
It's like
So when we make those commensurates, we're assuming a certain number of vacancies. So we factor that into maintaining NOI. Not that the unit that he's tracking is vacant, but the commensurate. So that may be where the confusion is.
Right.
Well, no. We included up through last year, but now we don't have the one with vacancy separate. But vacancy, we now have a CPI adjusted that will always include vacancy because our guideline by state law is used on vacancy leases now. So there's no point to, right, so they converge. So we made one formula now at this point.
So prior to 2019, there were other adjustments that you could take on vacancy, and that's why the blended one was important to use, because otherwise you're not counting those additional increases that come in on vacancy. So you would get a higher commensurate if you didn't use the vacancy. And to Andrew's point, because there's no more flexibility on vacancy and it's all RGB, there's no need to produce the CPI commensurate with the vacancy blend as well. I guess so.
Which we may, so that's the only one difference now.
So clearly, as you can see from the chart, the longer the tenancy continues, the larger the gap becomes between where that base legal rent should be to maintain NOI versus where it actually is under the adopted guidelines. And by adopting guidelines by lower than the commensurate, especially for the outer boroughs, the RGB is allowing the NOI to decline and letting all the issues that come along with that to take into place. I mean, we heard from the CPC that distress is hitting their portfolio, and it's largely due to what you see on the chart and the prior charts. Obviously, this is bad for housing providers, but the larger concern for this board should be the impact it has on the housing stock, the ability to maintain, the ability to continue to do upgrades, and continue to provide safe quality housing for the residents. Again, I mentioned it, but just again, Core Manhattan clearly has the ability to recover when they have downturns in the market. I mentioned they were down. Core Manhattan was down 21% in NOI last year, and this year is up 42%, which drives the 10% increase in overall citywide NOI. But if you peel out Core Manhattan and you peel out all the post-73 regulated buildings, you're looking at a citywide drop of around 16%. And that's really concerning, and that's where we think the board should be focusing. And it's also worth noting that nearly 80% of rent-stabilized apartments in pre-74 buildings are outside the core of Manhattan. So this is a huge, huge chunk of the housing stock, and it is suffering. These apartments are not keeping up with operating costs, and we're seeing NOI decline and quite frankly a lot more defaults, loan defaults and other types of distress than we thought we would see this soon. Again, this is the building stock that should be driving the board's discussion. We not buried in the appendices somewhere, not buried in a footnote somewhere. These pre-1974 regulated buildings really need help, and they really, at some point it becomes a point of a point of no return, for lack of a better term, and the gradual increases that this board could provide to slowly build these NOIs back and build some fiscal stability back for these buildings. You could do it gradually by a couple of percentage points over the commensurate for a couple of years, or they could continue on the same track, and at some point there's going to need to be a major restructuring, whether it's double-digit increases or some other mechanism. But it's pretty clear that these low base rents cannot continue to support the operating costs for these buildings. And so I don't have a chart for this, but it is in my testimony. Just taking a quick look at debt service. So going back to this NOI chart for the pre-1974 buildings. If we're looking at assuming that a building either took out a loan or refinanced sometime in 2018, 2019, somewhere a couple of years before 2019, and their debt service coverage ratio was roughly 1.3, which I think is has been testified as a reasonable debt service coverage to start out with. And this is on page 3 of my testimony that you have in front of you. If we look at the NOI from the Bronx buildings and we assume that there was a 1.3 debt service coverage in 2019, when those units were producing $358 in NOI per month, and then so that sets the debt service coverage roughly at, I think, around 251. So if you have NOI at 358 and your debt service coverage is 1.3, your actual debt payment from the NOI is $251. So assuming that 250, so now that 251 is constant, right? So no matter what NOI does moving forward, you're paying $251 out of that NOI. So as that NOI drops, so in 2022, Bronx pre-74 earning $282 per apartment. 251 of those dollars are going to debt service. So, you know, its coverage is now, it's paying now 90% of its operating income, of its NOI towards debt service, when it really is only supposed to be paying 70%, and that's actually supposed to be getting better over time, and instead it's getting worse. I mean, I think you've had M&T Bank here to testify that that is how lending and underwriting works. They start at a 70% roughly operating expenses going to debt service, and that is expected to improve over time. If debt service continues to decline, that's why we're seeing defaults. That's why we're seeing banks going under, community banks with large portfolios to rent stabilized, having to be taken over and bailed out. This is all part of it. If you want to take it a step further and look at that Bronx pre-74 building and say, you know, maybe they were a little aggressive in their lending and they started at an 80% debt service coverage, so it was 1.2 in 2019. In 2022, that building's now underwater. And that, so at 1.2, it would be paying $286 per month in 2019 to debt service. And in 2022, it doesn't even have enough NOI to cover that because it's only at 282. So this is why we think the board needs to focus on these buildings. They don't really have much of a future if that decline keeps happening. And we really feel that it's the board's obligation to ensure that this housing stock is maintained and can continue to be part of the affordable housing stock moving forward. You know, these factors that we're seeing, significant drops in NOI, increase in defaults on loans, increases in tax delinquencies, these were all factors that were present when New York City was facing a massive wave of abandonment in the 80s, right? In the 80s and the 90s. You know, obviously we're not at that point yet, but that seems to be where this trend is going. And it's really, really important that this board take note and try to reverse that trend. I mean, just for reference, when the city, back when the city was taking over buildings, because they were tax delinquent and using their transfer programs and everything like that, the only way that they were able to address the buildings and get them off of their rolls was to restructure the rents, because they were not sustaining the building expenses. That's why all that stuff happened. So when they took those buildings over, the only way they were able to restore them and basically be able to sell them to someone else was to restructure the rents, because that's sort of what we've been talking about. Without a major restructuring after all of this, there's no way to revive the building, and that's something that we're hoping that we can avoid. But again, the bigger concern is really about the loss of housing if these buildings aren't given sufficient resources to continue to operate and improve. So not only is NOI skewed by the inclusion of the core Manhattan buildings and the post 73, but so is the commensurate, because those buildings have higher base rents. They don't need as much as a percentage increase to cover the operating costs. And again, I think this was also testified by CPC, but the way it works is if you have a low rent unit, it doesn't have the cushion that the higher rent units have. And so if you're not making sure that all the operating costs are accounted for, then you begin to see NOI decline. And it happens faster in the low rent units, and I think that's why you may see the more significant distress in the Bronx and in Upper Manhattan, because the rents up there are typically lower, and therefore they don't have as much cushion. That's it for me. I have more, but I will cede my time and pass the baton here.
Before we start, I just want to make sure if there are any questions particular to Joe that are fresh. I want to hear from everyone. Obviously, we want to make sure we want to watch time, but if there's anything particular from that. Yeah. I mean, we want to hear from everyone, but Joe, I want to make sure. And if we could just turn that off, because it's, sorry. Apologies.
Thanks, Joe. I just had one question about the mortgage finance part specifically, because we've done a survey through the RGB to investigate the presence of mortgages among owners of rent-stabilized buildings, and one of the things we found is that many building owners do not have mortgages at all. About half of owners, roughly, in the survey, especially for owners of smaller buildings, do not have mortgages. So I guess I just want to ask you if that lines up with your experience and experience of your members, that there is this sort of available equity out there.
No, not amongst my membership. I mean, did you say half? Half?
Yeah.
That's very surprising to me, and it doesn't. It's something that I'm happy to look into and see if we could get some better data on. But that is not my experience with my membership.
I would just point out, I think it's really more 45%, not half, and also what was the sample size of the number of respondents?
It was 617.
617, assuming that's 617 building owners out of how many?
I don't know, 15,000.
Yeah. 15,000.
I mean, this has been a perpetual issue, I understand, for many, many years about but it's hard for us to evaluate without the data, as you point out, Joe. So your members should be encouraged to complete these surveys, because they're actually very valuable information for us.
Absolutely.
I mean, a less than 1% completion rate is, I'm assuming it's statistically significant. I'm not a statistician.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm using, as Arpit's saying, that data to help guide some of our thinking.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not right, you got to get people to give us data.
That's fine. I think some of this is worrying about again the sample size, and even if it was 50-50, you have 50% of the buildings that are underwater, right? And are if they're not, they're headed there. So I mean, we can let the tail wag the dog, but I think you need to focus on where the distress is and the buildings where it's happening, and not use, again, like not using core Manhattan to say, everything is fine. Not using you're not cherry picking data to sort of say everything is fine. I think the mortgage survey, unfortunately, is not well. It doesn't have a lot of responses. I don't think banks respond to it either. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to improve the data in that report.
Yeah, I mean, this was a separate addition to the owner survey that we send around to gather insurance. It's the same vehicle that we use to gather this debt service data. And it's 4%, Doug, not 1%.
I'd like to add some personal experience to that question. We have a small 6-unit with no mortgage, and we have a 19-unit with a mortgage. We can't tap into the equity because the banks are going to loan us money if we can't pay it back.
Thank you. Any other questions? Kelly, please. Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Farrell. I'm a policy analyst for the Rent Stabilization Association. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to present testimony on behalf of our members. Our members own and manage approximately 1 million apartments. The majority of our membership own buildings between 6 and 20 units, and the next largest group owns between 21 and 100 units. RSA members come from every neighborhood and every community in the 5 boroughs and beyond. On behalf of our members, we thank you for providing the economic data that quantifies the challenges owners are facing and giving us, and by extension then, a platform to share insights. New York City's rent-stabilized buildings are facing an insolvency crisis. The growth in expenses is outpacing the growth of rent, which is income. Expenses are rising at twice the rate of income, and the impact of this is devastating, particularly in lower-income neighborhoods and for the most affordable units. As you all heard, CPC testimony validates what our members are telling us. They quantified the scope of the stress and the challenges affordable housing providers are experiencing today. Last year, the CPC testified they were seeing signs of distress in the affordable housing stock, and this year, CPC testified distress is here. And why that is happening is simple enough. Expenses are outpacing income. Income is up 7%, but expenses have risen 14%. This is an unsustainable model as more and more buildings lack sufficient operating income. RGB reveals that the number of buildings in distress has increased over 10% in the last year. I know your report had noted it's 8.8 to 9.9, but that's frankly a 10% increase in 1 year in distressed buildings. That should be alarming to everyone on this board. This is a result of a number of factors, each impactful in their own, but when taken together now are leading to stress and distress in the affordable stabilized housing market. One factor in all of this is the impossibility of bringing vacant apartments back to market because operational costs exceed rents. Apartments with the lowest rents remain off the market because the allowable increases do not generate sufficient funds to cover the cost to operate a unit. RGB and CPC consensus is that operational costs are about $1,200 a month, not including debt service. Based on our records, and this is RSA, as we do a rent registration service for our members, we file data directly with HCR for them. We register approximately 102,000 units, so 996,000 the stabilized market, so just over 10%. And we have found that 35% of the vacant apartments have been vacant for 3 or more years, and that we also see that 50% of the vacant apartments rent for below $1,500. It is economically infeasible to renovate and operate these units. To gain additional insights into what may be happening in the rent-stabilized market, we conducted a survey with industry partners. All of our members participated in this survey. We put that out, and that was to develop fact-based information on the impacts of the HSTPA. About 11% of the rental stock had responses. 242,000 units are represented in this of the city, so it's stabilized in both stabilized and non-stabilized units. The study revealed that there are higher vacancy rates for owners with small portfolios that are moderately or predominantly rent stabilized. Longer-term vacancies have trended upwards between 2018 and 2023. Economic infeasibility of unit improvements at the end of a long tenancy was the reason for the continued vacancy. 99% of small portfolios that are over 75% rent stabilized reported they are in need of MCIs. 78% of the units in small portfolios that are over 70% stabilized reported they needed IAIs. From our records, we can see that IAI, and that's not survey, it's our records, have that IAI filings have declined 77% since 2019, and that kitchen and bathroom improvements, the members report, are the IAIs most needed across all building types. There's new legislation out of Albany to increase IAIs, and attempts to address this issue, but the amounts will not solve the problem. I went back and I actually watched last year's hearing, so I went over, to see exactly what was of concerns of yours and some of the issues we had touched on last year. Cost of compliance. Again, this continues to be an issue. Costs grow. They are not accounted for in the PIOC. And this is, again, additional expenses, which are additional stresses upon the building. Last year, we gave you 24 things that are not covered. There are at least 3 more or 4 more this year, including enhanced XRF testing, accelerated turnover with a child present in a lead-painted unit, additional HPD paperwork, and now there are parapet inspections for all buildings, whether or not they're covered by local law 11, and it includes the smallest buildings as well. All of these regulations require compliance, and all of them have costs attached. Labor, services, thousands of dollars can be in plumbing or wiring or remediation or brickwork, the administrative time, and the legal fees. And they are a regular, repeating, always increasing drain on building income, not considered in the PIOC. Last year, you also had a number of questions about insurance. And one of the discussions that went on for a while was whether or not these skyrocketing costs were a transitory or a consistent cost driver in the PIOC. So 21.7% this year. Last year it was 12.9, the year before 10.9, the year before that 18.8%. So I think it's pretty clear where this is headed. The RSA survey that I referenced earlier showed over the past 10 years, insurance costs have increased dramatically at nearly the 10-year pace of any other expense category. So I was trying to find some context. I know last year we talked about number of admitted carriers, increased costs for reduced coverage, assessment of risk, especially due to HSTPA, replacement costs, empty apartment, personal injury claims, and climate-related claims. And since it rose, in the greatest proportion in the PIOC, I went back to our insurance experts to get some more insight this year, and perhaps there were some more reasons. One, it's vacant apartments are leading to higher premiums, no question. 2, this was really interesting. So what's going on, and I did not realize the scope of what's happening. Insurers will bind a policy, and then they perform what's called a loss control inspection. They go on site at the building, and they do an inspection. And then at that time, they're going to the building owners and they're requiring updates to maybe the electrical, plumbing, or other mechanical systems, and you have to do that in 30 days. So some building, someone walks in and says you have 30 days to do this. If you don't complete it, they pull the insurance. This is work that must be done. It is a mandate even greater than, frankly, a government mandate, because a government mandate, you might get a violation, there might be a penalty. The insurance, what they do is they pull your insurance. When your insurance is pulled, your lender pulls your loan, so you lose your building. So what's going on is they cannot comply. You cannot get electrical permits in 30 days, let alone get into the apartments, let alone hire the contractor, let alone complete the work. So what happens when this goes on is you have to go in the secondary market or the non-admitted or specialty carriers. And so I was speaking to our insurance person yesterday, and she said, this week this happened, a small owner in Brooklyn. They got their insurance policy, they came out to perform the inspection. They were told, and I believe it was an electrical upgrade, but I'm not 100% sure, but I believe they were told they had to do a full electrical upgrade. Obviously, they can't do it. So right now, that owner is actually calling family members to try and borrow money because his insurance premium went up from $21,000 to $56,000. And that's what happened this week. And that's just one carrier in a small building in Brooklyn. This is happening throughout the city. Insurers now are also claiming that they had discounted the market for the past 10 to 12 years. And so now they're bringing their prices up to be more realistic. And they're citing its catastrophic losses nationwide, deteriorated apartment conditions in New York, and a need to increase rates for the insurers to remain solvent and to cover their local losses. So, I mean, that's the insurance picture as the update for this year. You also were focusing a lot on housing court last year, housing court delays. Understand that delays in housing court put pressure on income because that's frankly where problems are solved. That is something we have maintained landlords, tenants get in the same room, whether there's a voucher, a one-shot, things, rent gets paid, problems are solved. So when you don't get into housing court, problems are not getting solved. This is putting the pressure on collections, which is both the RGB and the CPC reported as an issue. This is also increasing and driving up administrative costs because you're hiring attorneys, you're doing paperwork, and it's all continues to put pressure on the housing stock. Until housing court becomes better, it's going to be a problem for both landlords and tenants. And then in wrapping up, I just have to offer the cautionary tale about the potential impact of the new good cause eviction legislation that will have on these subsidized buildings. There's now a cap on the free market rent units, which is another cap, another throttle on income, which will put more pressure on these buildings going forward, increase stress. That's something that, while it's technically not within, an RGB concern, it's an impact on rent-stabilized buildings that income is now being capped with no corresponding decrease in expenses. We will be supplementing our testimony with written response in the next few weeks, and I thank you very much for your time and for my colleagues' help for going forward with this.
Thank you so much. Andrew?
The survey you referred to, was that the what we circulated for the board members?
I believe it was
Okay.
given to you in advance, correct?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, if you could just, what was the name? I'm sorry.
I'll be glad to, I'll send it over to you later today.
Yeah, we had it was a slideshow, it was a summary of so I just want to make sure when
Okay,
you
yes.
were talking about the survey, the board members had it, but they
Yes.
do. Okay.
Other questions? Thank you so much.
Good morning. My name is Reggie Thomas from the Real Estate Board of New York. Many of you know my colleague, Basha Gerhards, who actually wanted to miss time away from the kids to be here, but she's at home with the kids at the moment for the holidays. So thank you for indulging me. For those of you who don't know anything about REBNY, REBNY at the end of the day is sort of a real estate institution that represents what we call the ecosystem that is real estate. So we represent commercial, residential, institutional property owners, builders, managers, investors, brokers, salespeople, dog catchers, anyone that has something to do with real estate. And as part of that, we do represent owners who are the owners and managers of tens of thousands of rent-stabilized units. We can't thank you all enough for allowing us to testify, as well as to the staff for their assistance throughout this process. As you know, the annual rent guidelines established by the RGB are the only meaningful system-wide path for financial solvency, and therefore housing quality for stabilized apartments. As we have noted annually, since the passage of the HSTPA in 2019 and the elimination of vacancy allowances, these adjustments are also the principal way to change rents at turnover as well. These rent adjustments are critically necessary for owners to keep up with routine costs, such as property taxes and insurance, as Kelly eloquently just discussed, and keep their buildings in a state of good repair for the residents they serve. Therefore, given the importance of the board's decision and to help the RGB make such decision based on the most recent data available, what we did is a number of our organizations commissioned a study led by HRNA advisors to study more current revenue and expense data and change over the past 4 years. This was conducted in April, and that study includes data for 2023 that was submitted to the City of New York in March of 2024. This study utilized 1,850 owner-provided TC-201 tax forms from 2019 to 2023, and it represents over 291 buildings. And it was done to examine increases to owner expenses and the impact on income on a longitudinal basis. This is the third year we've taken this exercise, and in the RGB staff reports last year and this year, our expense information from each of the prior years was affirmed. Presently, the TC-201 data shows yet again that property taxes, fuel, and insurance are driving expense growth, and expenses have increased 10.8% over the past year. To keep buildings in good physical condition for those who live in them, we encourage this board to consider holistically the decreasing net operating income, decreasing income, and increasing expenses and distressed building stock in its deliberations for the 2024 guidelines. In that holistic lens, we want to place the Manhattan NOI numbers in context. As you know, Manhattan has some of the most expensive real estate and land prices in the country. This means that any new construction is going to cost more, and its debt numbers will be more than elsewhere, and that existing apartment buildings are going to be assessed at a higher value as well. It has a significant number of larger buildings due to the permitted zoning and development history of New York City, and along with portions of the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront, an outsized share of newer construction. That newer construction was more expensive to build, and by the board's own reports, that new construction was built under the 421A tax incentive program and provided nearly all of the newly stabilized units in the past decade. These properties have higher rents because of those higher costs, and while they are required to pay a mini tax and generate tens of millions of dollars per project in mortgage recording and construction sales taxes, they're not presently paying the 20% or higher share of their residential revenue and city taxes the way some of our colleagues in their buildings do. The stabilized system should not be judged by this outlier. The Signature Bank stabilized pool sold at a nearly 40% discount to the value of the stabilized properties. The number of distressed buildings increased again per the RGB staff reports for the 6th year in a row, with 27.1% of distressed buildings in the Bronx. In pre-1974 Bronx stabilized properties, which are predominantly stabilized properties, NOI is down 18.5%. The average citywide monthly rent is $1,574, below the average citywide monthly expenses of $1,664. The RGB's responsibility is to this system of stabilized properties citywide. Unfortunately, for the city's fiscal health, decreases in NOI do result in an adverse fiscal impact on property taxes. For every 1% drop in NOI across the rent-stabilized stock, rent-stabilized apartments will generate $67 million less in property taxes. Potential NOI reduction is estimated between 40 to 60% across the rent-stabilized stock by the early 2030s if current expense and income patterns persist. This means that the property tax revenue generated by the city's rent-stabilized stock could fall $1.3 to $2 billion on an annual basis. RGB increases over the last decade have averaged at about 1.3% annually, while RGB reported expense growth was 4% annually. In the last 5 years alone, expense growth has been 4.9% annually, and rent increases have still averaged 1.3% annually. This imbalance has to be corrected one way or the other. And with the passage of good cause, it's disingenuous for advocates to claim in proceedings that market rate units and their rents included in Manhattan will be in a position to, in perpetuity, carry the expenses of the rent-stabilized units. It is the RGB now more than ever that carries this responsibility to ensure rent growth does not fall behind expense growth. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify at this morning's hearing.
Thank you. Any questions? Arpit.
Yeah, thank you for your testimony. So I want to follow up on the property tax question because I think you said a few different things there. So one was the increase in property taxes that members are facing. And then another thing was the decrease in NOI that you think building owners are also experiencing. So how is it that you think this property tax increase is happening despite the decrease in NOI, right? Does that reflect changing tax rates on buildings? Does that reflect inaccurate assessments? What do you think is driving the property tax increase among building owners?
Sure. And on that one, I'll be honest, Arpit, I'm going to have Basha follow up on that one specifically. I think from our experience, and especially I think in relation to good cause, in that last part, I kind of want to, what we found up in Albany, I think legislators and public policy and government officials are increasingly coming to the realization that multifamily residential is just taxed at a much higher rate than other property classes, right? At the end of the day, it's sort of a balance that has to be met, and those property taxes do eat at the ability for the folks on the table, especially Ann and Sharon, to deliver on quality housing units for their residents. So I don't want to punt on the question, but I want to make sure I get you a data-driven question, and Bosch is probably the best person for that.
So Reggie, just to add to that, I mean, we do have some data, and obviously we have to understand it in context about valuation increases in the assessment. And so a sort of refinement of Arpit's question for the follow-up is how you reconcile that assessment valuation increase with the other data and the concerns about the kind of fiscal health of the portfolio. And that's true Manhattan, but also true outer boroughs. In fact, in some parts of the outer boroughs, a larger valuation increase.
I appreciate the question. We'll make sure we follow up with the board as soon as possible.
And maybe just a quick follow-up here as well. So you also, I just want to make sure I got the numbers right. So you said that you're forecasting or predicting a $1.3 to $2 billion per year decrease in citywide property taxes received among rent-stabilized buildings if
current expense and income patterns persist.
Doug, please.
Can I just ask kind of a more global question of the group in total? And I think, Joe, you sort of touched upon this briefly in your testimony. There are a number of tools available, not perfect. J51 is one. The DHCR hardship, which, Joe, you went through some. There are, I think by reported data, something like 1,600 buildings that were distressed, right? Somewhere 1,400, somewhere in that range. What's your sense of why the uptake on some of those programs are so limited? Especially the new J51. I'm really curious about that.
Thanks, Doug. First, I would just like to note the distressed property count doesn't include debt service, right? So
Correct.
there's probably a larger number of distressed properties than this board is actually reporting. And again, kind of went through that a little bit in the testimony, but just wanted to flag that is also an undercounting of the distress that's happening out there. As far as the programs that are available for owners, in particular the J51, there are new AMI requirements for the units to be in place before you can qualify for the J51. So that's one that's one of the big, I think, deterrents to more buildings participating in the J51, because they are required to be already providing housing to low-income families, and they just can't meet the percentages that are
It's not 100%, right? It's something less.
It's less, but
Yeah.
it's still a high.
In some cases, it's
I don't have it
15.
in front of me, but
Yeah.
those
Okay.
that's one of the.
Okay.
It's something like I don't know. I'll get you. I'll
Right,
follow
no,
up with it. But that's as far as the J51 goes. That's one of the issues. And then if in my written testimony I go through a little bit more on why the hardship applications are not really suited to this type of relief. You can't have any tax delinquencies. You can't be challenging your tax assessments if you're going to apply for hardship. So if you have those pending, you can't apply. If you have violations on the building, you can't apply. And you also have to have 12 months you have to be operating the building at a loss for 12 months before you can even submit an application. And that operating income has to be, I think you have to be your expenses have to be 95% or higher than your hardship. So unless you're at more than 95%, you're automatically not going to qualify. So these buildings, if those are the qualifications, these buildings are already pretty far advanced into distress that, a hardship granting. And don't forget, if you qualify, if you actually get a hardship, they only give you a rent increase to bring you back to 95%. So there's no significant relief. It's just bringing that building back to a 95% operating expense to income ratio. So and aside from that, it takes years. It takes years for them to get processed. So you've operated the building at a loss for a year. You're probably already delinquent on some of your loans. You potentially are delinquent on taxes. You're certainly trying to challenge them and bring them down. So that disqualifies you off the bat. But let's say that's not applicable. You're getting your increase 3 years after you filed it, and you're operating the building at a loss for now 4 years. I don't know how many owners are still going to be owning that building at that point. So that's why hardship doesn't really is not really suited to this. And if you look at historically hardship applications with HCR, when they were the highest, it was in the late the 80s and the early 90s. Even in that time of significant distress, the most hardship applications filed in a year were maybe 50. So you're talking about 50 buildings out of 15,000, right, that filed. And that was in a period of significantly more distress than we're in right now. So it just kind of goes to show you that the hardship process or program wasn't really designed to provide the kind of relief for the distress that we're seeing. As far as other HPD programs, right? I also touched on that in my testimony. If you look at the application portal on HPD, for every program, there is a disclaimer on the website that says, we are extremely short-staffed, we have limited capacity, we may not get back to you, you may not hear from us for a year. And at that point, if you hear from them in a year, then you're just starting the process of going through the inspections, getting some sort of scope of work, bidding out the contract. All of these HPD programs, they require at least 3, you have to bid it out to 3 different contractors. You have to use the contractors that they list. So aside from all the administrative, requirements and checking the boxes, HPD doesn't even have the capacity to handle these applications. Even for the not-for-profits, I don't know if you're familiar with private housing finance law 610, which allows not-for-profits to charge a higher legal rent if they're housing a voucher holder there. The backlog for HPD is significant for that program. That's a new program. It's even for these not-for-profit housing providers who presumably have some higher priority, they're seeing their applications delayed in a backlog. So, look, we're not saying that that's not a solution, but it's not being used as a solution, and it's not available as a solution in the current state of things.
And I would just add that the program is really not very well known. The first time I testified at a RGB hearing, 10 or 12 years ago, that was a question that was asked of me, one of the members of the board, have you taken advantage of the hardship program? And I didn't even know it existed, so there's not a lot of, knowledge among owners that the program is out there. But I do know somebody that applied last year, and I did check with him, before coming here today to see what the status of that application was, and it's still pending, as it's been since he submitted the application last year. And with no
success stories.
Right, and there's just no communication either, like he doesn't really know, like is it pending, it's under a review, like is there something missing? It's just continues to, and he's unable to get, any feedback on, what the status, what's holding it up, so. Right, it's just pending, right, and it's like that holding pattern is, because, he took these steps thinking maybe this will be a solution, and, he doesn't know if it will be.
If I could just add one thing to what Ann and Joe had said. I mean, as you all know, there's really 2 ways to assist a property owner, either some sort of a tax abatement or some sort of direct grant. And, even legislators were proposing to put programs that would give a grant of $50,000, $100,000 into a property. And even then, property owners were still like, we're never going to see this. It's going to, hire attorneys, trying to, as Joe mentioned, just trying to apply, then wait a year, see if you're even eligible. There's a lack of, I don't want to say trust, but there's a lack of faith that government, for better or for worse, is not going to be able to move forward and execute on a lot of these. I think one prime example of this is, as you know, the New York City HPD has a program called Unlocking Doors, where they were going to provide, I believe, $25,000. We, with all due respect to our colleagues in city agencies, we refer to as unlocking door, because I think they had one done over the past year, and that was free money that was being given, not free, but it was a grant, it's our taxpayer dollars. And I say this with all due respect to the HPD staff. Joe hit it on the nail. I mean, the HPD staff are overburdened, understaffed at that agency. And, that's part of the problem is the staffing, but the second big part of it is the hoops that you have to go through just to apply for it in and of itself makes it almost cost prohibitive to bother.
Yeah, when you get HPD on the phone, they're really apologetic. It's not like they're like anti-owner. They're just like, we are running, there's, nonstop inquiries and we have no capacity to administer this. They're really apologetic like 9 months after you're supposed to talk to them. So it's not like the government's bad, it's just they're completely unfunded.
Thank you, Sean. Ann and Sharon, please. Thank you.
So we've introduced ourselves again, but I would just like
We are a 100% volunteer organization. Grassroots started, 40 years ago, in 1984. So our perspective, that we bring here today is, not a kind of polished professional, but it's real experience. So we're really grateful for the opportunity to speak to all of you today. So many SPONY members are the owners and operators of small buildings, the typical 6 to 10 unit building that you'll see all around New York City. There are approximately 22,000 rental buildings that are this size, and we estimate that there could be as many as 160,000 units in these small buildings. Your deliberations impact these smaller buildings, but your data does not include these small buildings. So your data is missing a key component of the market, and it's a component that's in trouble. So there's been a long cycle of underfunding the pre-1974 rent-stabilized buildings due to inadequate rent increases, which, that chart that Joe showed earlier, it shows that. And our inability to keep up with housing, the operating costs for this housing is impacting the quality of the housing that we provide to a large number of New Yorkers that live in these very old buildings. Clearly, the financial stability of these buildings, of the owners, directly impacts the stability of the residents that we house. I reviewed the PIAC report, in getting ready to speak here today, and, a couple of things jumped out at me. There was a statement that said, the PIAC is becoming more and more challenging in recent years, or projecting that, and Sharon and I can, tell you that operating these buildings too is becoming more and more challenging. You spoke about the taxes, how it's getting harder to project that. I know I see Sharon sitting here with her tax bills, so we're going to be able to share that with you. That is too becoming very difficult for us to project. And then the insurance component, which I know Kelly spent a bit of time talking about, is rising, and I'm ready to share those numbers with you now. So I think maybe Sharon and I can share a few examples of just, what we're seeing in our own buildings. So I think I'll jump into the insurance. Going back, in 2020 when COVID hit, my building's insurance bill was $12,700. And last year it was $22,600. I don't know how to project for that. It's just, it could be, who knows? It could be 40,000 by next year, and the same with my taxes, right? And when the pandemic started, our taxes were just under 78,000. Last year, 92. We don't know what the tax rate will be yet. I mean, I could be looking at a $100,000 tax bill this year for a 10-unit building.
Someone asked a question about why taxes are increasing. Your guess is as good as mine, because mine went from 30,000 to 44,000, and it's now 52,000. And this is on a property located in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So I don't know when they were typing in the assessment, somebody sneezed and they added an additional number, but my taxes are now up 75% over 3 years. And I can't budget for that. I don't know where it's going this year. As Ann said, insurance is also up. We had a carrier that was covering us for about 7 years, and they dropped us because we had an eviction case. We have never made a claim in 35 years of ownership, but because we had an eviction case pending, they dropped us as a reason for not covering us. So our insurance went from $12,000 that year to $15,000, and then it's now at $22,000. That's, keeps going, and we don't know where it's going to end. The board gives us what they think are adequate increases, but my rent roll in particular only went up 2%, even though the guidelines board was 3.2 and 5 in 2023. And that's because of timing issues. So my rent on a 19-unit building went from $19,737 to $20,000. That barely covers postage on the letters I need to send out annually. That's the same building with a tax increase. Joe was talking about the debt service coverage ratio. We were fortunate. Early 2019, we took out financing to take care of some projects. We were able to point the building, but the rest of the funds went to cover operating costs because we had 3 tenants who didn't pay rent for 2 years. Our ratio went from 1.3, as Joe said, to now 1.1. We have a second building that also had a loan, same process. We were going to change the windows. We didn't change the windows because we can't afford to, and that funding is covering this 19-unit building because the rent is just not there. You know, I don't know what to tell you guys. My parents started this in 1975, and I'm at the end. You know, the rents don't cover the expenses, and we have no control over the expenses. You guys have control over, so, you know, helping us survive, and we provide affordable housing in New York. Rents are $1,000. You know, Manhattan, they say $4,500. We don't see that. My average rent is $1,000, $900. I have people paying $500 and $600. So 3% on $500 and $600 is, while it may mean something to the tenant, it doesn't cover much for us. So we need proper increases to continue to maintain our buildings.
Yeah, you know, Sharon mentioned, you know, how many tenants were unable to pay rent. You know, my building, we were very lucky during the height of COVID. You know, we didn't have any rental arrears. Like, kind of our arrears crisis happened a little bit later. And it was, you know, a longtime tenant who had been with us over 11 years, and he lost his job after COVID. And very quickly, you know, he was behind like $15,000. And, you know, that's a loss that's really very hard for us to absorb. $15,000 is, you know, 2/3 of my insurance bill. You know, so one tenant in a small building, you know, is going to impact the ability for us to keep up with those expenses. You know, and the people that live in the building feel that too. You know, it impacts the quality of their housing. You know, so these lingering effects of COVID throughout our segment, you know, these small buildings, you know, is still being felt. You know, the long delayed and underfunded ERAP, which left some rental arrears never covered, you know, is, you know, has kind of led to a condition where, you know, small owners are really like working off of cash. We're not financing properties a lot, so you hold money in reserves, and our reserves are gone. You know, they're kind of long gone, and we need this board to recognize that, you know, running these old buildings requires adequate rent, so that these annual increases, you know, that you vote on are really vitally important to the stability of these buildings, especially, you know, 100% rent stabilized buildings in the outer boroughs that have rents like Sharon just mentioned. You know, $700 rents, you know, or 1984 rents, or you said your parents bought the buildings in the 70s, right? You know, in 2024, we just can't make that work. So I just, you know, wanted to just add that, you know, every increased cost and every dollar lost in missed income, you know, has a more severe impact on the small buildings. We have no economy of scale, no ability to share compliance and regulatory expenses over a larger portfolio. We have no buying power, and small building operators need these rent adjustments, like I said, especially in the outer boroughs, the pre-1974 buildings. You know, we are housing, you know, a large number of New Yorkers, and, you know, we just really need, you know, to be real thoughtful about what that increase is going to be this year. You know, and finally, I just want to say, you know, that Sharon and I are here today to kind of give voice to all these small building operators, you know, that are, you know, busy still running the heat because it's like, what, 40 degrees today, right, in April. You know, and, you know, we're trying to give voice to them because the data that you're using, you know, isn't capturing our buildings. And we just, you know, maybe the time has come to, I mean, you made a change a couple years ago, right, separating out pre and post 74 buildings. Maybe it's time to, you know, make some data that's just representing that particular segment of the market.
Thank you. Questions? Doug, please.
I wonder, and obviously, you know, how much you want to disclose, I understand, but I'm just curious about for your buildings, what kind of debt do you have on the buildings, even as a debt service coverage ratio, and like when is it coming due? Like what are you worried about, right, a changing interest rate environment, et cetera? What if you could talk a little bit, or for other members that have smaller?
I'm not worried about it due. I'm worried about making the monthly payments. I'm worried about making the monthly payments, not worried about when it's due.
Right.
That's what
So
we
you
are.
do have some you're paying off some debt on your buildings,
Yeah,
mortgage.
we took out financing in 2019 to do improvements, and
Right.
the rent is no longer covering because our
Covering it,
expenses
right.
are so high.
Can I ask how long of a term you had on that mortgage, that debt?
We had a 30-year.
30 year. Oh, you were able to get okay, because we hear often with buildings that it's a very short term on the debt.
No, we were able to
But
do
you
a
were able to get
30-year.
a 30 year, probably because you're good.
Yeah, I would just add that, the profile of, a lot of small owners, and the preference to kind of, once maybe your parents or grandparents satisfied that first mortgage,
Right.
to not get back on that
Right.
financing merry-go-round. So, people are just very conservative, put a lot of money in reserves and kind of live off the cash of the rent roll and just say, okay, this year I'm going to do this upgrade and this upgrade. We did, 2 years ago, do a small loan on one of our buildings, just because we were very concerned about cash flow. So it was, a $500,000 loan, for 5 years, so it's a short term. So, right, I mean, we didn't, like I said, we didn't want to get into, doing a really big financing and, just because what the value of the buildings were, we had no idea, we didn't want to pull out any more than that, and then 5 years, from now, be worried about, that the value of the building might not be there. Yeah, but I think that's, a lot of small owners, like I said, are not, aggressively financing.
But even still, I can chime in here, I mean, mortgages do.
Sean, sorry. Yeah, I just want to make sure you have a mic.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't.
Otherwise the
I
folks-
speak rather loud, and sorry I was late. I went to the wrong building. I'm glad I'm in this building because this was a little hectic over at 111 Center Street. To answer your question, because this is a really good one of what's happening when the mortgage comes due, the balloon, and obviously the values have been very impaired, and you hear a lot about this, and this is playing out real time. So, one option, and this is what should really scare the board and scare all, New York City citizens, is the owners have two options, basically. They are now going from a conventional loan, which is a lower interest rate, and the only option for them, especially if they have any types of problems whatsoever, any violations, any arrears, any open overcharge cases, the only available option are the loan sharks, the 12% default interest type of groups. And that is just another maybe year bridge to hope that something mechanically changes where these values go up and they can actually get taken out by somebody, that's going to buy the property or hire a broker or whatnot. So you can go the bridge route, which is basically like putting credit card interest on your building, or depending on what type of loan you have, it's either recourse or non-recourse. Most of these loans, for the most part, financed since 2014, were non-recourse, thank God. But there's a little trick here that the banks are enforcing. If you have recourse, you basically take the bridge and the credit card debt because they can go after your house now. You've basically financed everything. It's a personal guarantee. And if you don't have recourse and the value of the property is well below the loan amount, the conversations are playing out right now, and it's a game of chicken with the banks. Not really chicken, that's a bad analogy, but the owners are willing, if they have non-recourse debt, in theory, give the buildings back to the bank. They said, look, there's no hope in here. Either I need you to stop, basically do forbearance like during COVID, or reduce the loan amount and basically forgive the debt. But if not, I'm willing to give the keys back. If you want to manage it, Customers Bank, if you want to manage it in your community bank, here's the keys. Now, this is where it gets scary. The banks, because they do not want the keys, are looking into little provisions in the loan docs to say that you broke this and this covenant, and these are bad boy carve-outs, and because they're bad boy carve-outs, you're now subject to the personal guarantee. So here are the keys back. We own you. And now you're in a real pickle because you're looking at your house and your cars, and you thought you were taking non-recourse loans, which they are for most of the loan provisions, but there's little I call them foot fault covenants, where if you break these little foot fault provisions, they can, in theory, enforce the recourse, and they're basically doing that because they don't want this. These are toxic assets. And so that's what's playing out like real time. In the early stages of 19, 20, 21, after those rent laws were passed, the interest rates were so low that you could actually refinance, but now there's no chance. So, it's either going to credit card debt or trying to do a loan modification with the lender, and this is all just the most skilled negotiators are going to win because it's all legal beagle stuff, but, if you're not teamed up with the highest paid lawyers in town, like, you're just going to get creamed. So that's the no-win solution that's going on with anybody that financed more than 50% loan to value anytime since 2015 that owns Rent Regulated.
Yeah, just a follow up on this point. What would be the best sources of data, or what is the delinquency rate on mortgage holders with rent stabilized units? What is the best place to find that data? I think we had discussed at some point, Andrew, looking at the TRUP data as one proxy for delinquency statistics on this stock.
I think we got to subpoena the banks. The fact that Signature Bank, you got to think the equity sits above the loan amount. Like, the lenders are more easily able to finance because they're sitting way below. They're 60 to 70% of the value. So when a bank goes down, what does that mean for the equity that sits above the lender? That for sure is impaired. There's no value there. So the fact that a Signature Bank's down, that New York City, New York Community Bank needs to be rescued, the proof is kind of anecdotally very clear to see. But as far as like how many people are defaulting right now, the only way to get that information is directly from the banks. We could try to get people to volunteer that information. It's definitely playing out right now. I'm one of them. We stopped paying because there's no hope. We have to pay for the heat and the rest of the building, but the property taxes and the water and sewer on a small building that I own, there's no chance. And this is a really bad situation in this particular building. But people are stopping paying the mortgage right now. They're stopping paying the property tax. They're stopping paying the water because they'll keep putting the water on. You can't cut off the water service in New York City. You probably read about that. So they're stopping paying the things that can at least accrue while keeping on the heat and the electric and paying for the basic maintenance of the property so there's not violations, which can then, you're thrown in jail basically. So there's a lot of really tough decisions being made. But, I can tell you real time, almost every property. I'm a broker and I get used, my phone rings off the hook with what is my property worth. The first thing we look at is what is the loan amount, and we're like, are you already talking to the lender about the short sale? Like, it's like literally not even within 2 seconds. Unless you've owned the property for 30 or 40 years without basically taking any debt, the bank is having to be involved in any sale conversation. So it's hard to get that data pulled, but the banks have it. They know.
Questions? And Sean, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
I don't know if you had any other remarks. I know we jumped right into the Q&A, but
yeah, no, well, we can jump right in the Q&A. I'm just here anecdotally to say the same thing. I brought this. You're not going to let me entertain you because I didn't know if this was going to be one of those hearings where you just get drowned out. But this is the best way to describe a tax class 2 rent regulated building like the one that Sharon owns. You start out with this much sand. And over time, this is considered the sand money, and it just slowly slips out the bottom of this capsule. The only way that you used to be able to get more sand at the top was through the II. These RGB increases, they just stop the sand from going slower and slower, basically. And when you had low interest rates, you could actually play that kind of game. But make no doubt, like the sand is dripping out the bottom of all these properties. And I know that this is not the forum to do an II increase, but the II was the only way you could get the sand back up there again and start the slow trickle down. Because, right, what business do we know, if we look around, the country, that can survive in 2024 expenses with 1980s fixed rent? Like, imagine the supermarket that has 1980s prices but has to pay the 2024, tellers. So the system doesn't work unless you have a reset every now and then, and the IAI program used to basically subsidize the ability to keep all these other rents at these 1984, 1990s levels. But the sand is dripping out, and it's just dripping out faster now because there's no revenue growth and you can't finance anything. But that is this story. So I'm here anecdotally just to point out I'm a broker. I make my living off people that need to sell. There's more people that need to sell now than ever. There's no investable buyers. And it should really scare the board, not only to keep buildings afloat financially, but the psychology of why would anybody want to buy this asset class and support this asset class and invest in this asset class is really at stake, and it's going to
hurt tenants and owners alike. We're all part of the same boat. So, my testimony is basically that, nobody wants these buildings anymore, and I'm talking about rent-regulated housing, specifically tax class 2, which the taxes just keep going up and up and up because they're impossible to insure. The data that I looked at last night said something about like $840 per unit per year. Like, if that could be found, guys, we should all be insurance brokers because we can all make a killing. There's no such thing as these numbers. It's trailing 2 years data. Why is the insurance going up? Because the asset is a toxic asset. So in Florida, we have storms. In New York City, we have crazy laws and attorneys that are out for everything, and there's just skyrocketing premiums because these buildings are uninsurable. You like to insure something that has the possibility of maintaining value or going up in value, not a known decline in value. So insurance companies are smart. There's no way that they can recover, and they're looking exactly like Kelly, I think, mentioned. They bind your policy, and then they come there 30 days later, and they say, oh, the sidewalk is cracked. We're bumping the premium. Oh, there's a lead violation. Oh, you have a arrears case. And these buildings are becoming uninsurable. So if they're uninsurable, why would anybody buy them? You're going to self-insure a property? Like, this isn't oceanfront real estate. Like, it's a disaster. So that should scare the bejesus out of everybody. There's nobody that wants to finance them anymore either. The only people that own rent-regulated housing that are getting financing from the JP Morgan Chases and yada yada are the big customers that can bring in big deposits to their bank. They could care less about people that are smaller owners, care less. And that should scare the bejesus out of everybody. And why do they not want to finance them? Again, because they are a toxic asset right now. Like, why would you invest in toxic assets? The only thing that is getting refinanced are because they're trying to hem the bets. Let's refinance some people because we don't want to start a complete panic at the disco. But now that's already happening. Signature Bank is out, and your community bank is on lifelines. Everyone's concealing the problems as long as they possibly can because they don't want their banks to go under. But it's happening. We see it anecdotally. And the last thing is nobody wants to buy them. Again, none of us here on a personal level want to invest in something that we know for sure will lose value. And that is what is being asked of rent-stabilized owners. It's just plain to see. So, and then it would beg the question, like, some stuff is selling. It's at lower and lower prices. Who is buying them? Who are my customers? It's very few and far between. But the people that are just simply making the bet that they can start out with the cheaper price with enough sand that something has to change. The city will have to go bankrupt again, or they'll have to reinvent the III because it'll get so bad that they'll at least be able to survive it longer than the people that own right now. But it's simply a gamble, and it's the bottom feeders of the market. It's the people that you don't want to be owning this stuff. The people that are used to court and used to, kind of being slummy, to a certain extent. So that's what's going on in the underbelly of this. This report that I read last night, if it was all true, I would love to share this with buyers, but it's not what's happening with boots on the ground. It's completely, it's a very rosy picture, basically. And the fourth thing, and this goes to the psychology of the RGB member, and there's only so much you can do with this. We don't, no one wants to charge tenants more. We just want to be able, the owners just need to be able to keep things up and maintain. And I think, again, on a personal level, we all value better housing, better safety, better heat in the units. Like, people make trade-offs for value all the time, and I think tenants, if we stop the vitriol, would also agree with that. If they said, hey, I'm going to pay another $100 in rent, but like this, hallway's going to get cleaned twice a week, now, and all these things that improve things. But the last thing, and this goes to the psychology of it, is no one wants to buy this asset class or invest in this asset class because it's one of the most worst jobs in the world right now, or in the country. I mean, everyone hates you. You're definitely going to lose more and more money. The amount of bureaucratic administration things piling up, and that the government is kind of against you. So the psychology of the RGB vote, and I know we're not going to get anything that's going to significantly put more sand in the top, but it'll slow the trickle, but the psychology of it is very important because you want to give people some hope here because they're running out of hope. There's real capitulation happening in this marketplace, and that's just scary given 44% of the Department of Finance's budget comes from property and apartment building owners. So that's my testimony. It's a lot of it anecdotal, but I'm happy to include you on every setup and invite you to some meetings with people. It's just one of these things. Until you're in it, it's really hard to understand.
Hey, Sean, questions? Doug, please.
Kind of back to, maybe Kelly, you talked about this in terms of, I think you mentioned that you had collected some data on vacant units and on level of renovation required, not necessarily what would be, is that what you said?
We have we have data on vacant units because we do registrations. So that we have. We have data on rents because we do registrations.
Right.
We have data on IAIs because we do registrations.
Right.
But we don't know, we have survey information that tells us what people want. So there's a difference between what data we have versus what people are reporting.
Right. Do we have that, was that part of what you provided to?
The survey information is what we had provided. If you have specific information on vacancies, I'd be glad to go through some of this with you. I'm somewhat limited, sometimes I don't even know, we don't look for necessarily what other people want. So we know what we know because that's what we have in front of us. So sometimes there's an ability to get more information. I just don't know, what it is. But I can tell you, we know vacants. We've seen that.
I mean, I guess I'd be curious if you had, maybe you don't, data on longer-term vacancies, call it more than a year, and what the average rent of those units are as registered.
Sure, I can
You wouldn't know the level of renovation required, I understand that.
Well, we
but
can't know the level of renovation
Exactly.
required.
But if you knew those two things, at least that gives us some indication of something.
And I could, give you, an example. A tenant died in 2021. She had moved into the building in 1969, later in the year, so it was a rent stabilized, not a rent controlled unit. When she passed away, the rent was just under $1,100. And the early estimates we got to improve the apartment, and grant this was, say, 2021, 2022, when inflation was really soaring, supply chain issues and all that sort of stuff. The estimates ranged from $167,000 on the low end, plus electric, which was another contractor, another $13,000, up to $325,000. So I mean, those numbers were just so wildly different, and I don't know. I think some of the contractors just were having such a hard time pricing things because it was such an unstable time. So it was wild. So more recently. The estimate was $97,000 plus the electric, which is now $18,000, plus for kitchen cabinets, bathroom fixtures, and so on and so forth.
So just
Christine, please.
a couple of things. Thanks, everyone, by the way, for coming. The vacancy allowance that the board used to implement, I'm happy to do the research. I believe it started around the 90s, the early 90s, when the RGB implemented a vacancy allowance. But talking about sand and getting sand back into the top without affecting in-place tenants and having their expenses go up, if we gave Ann a vacancy allowance again, that would at least take a $600 rent, which I don't think anyone in this room thinks a $600 rent is logical on any sense. I mean, we would all love it, but it's not rational. But to take a vacant apartment that obviously needs a lot of work and allow a vacancy allowance, even if there used to be actually a bifurcation between a vacancy bump on a rent that was at a threshold, and having looked at these charts for years. So that's a thought. The other thought I had is that the vacancies have been brought to the attention of the legislature because the bill that just passed, which increased the amount of IAI allowable, has a requirement that the unit be vacant for a number of years. So there is some kind of information getting back to the state that the depletion of the IAI program it's just a non-winner. It's a non-starter on any level. But it would be meaningful if we could think about a vacancy bump on the pre-74 buildings and the super low rents, which wouldn't affect tenants.
Yeah, even for 1 year, I mean, it's hell.
it's going to affect, it's going to affect an incoming tenant, but it's certainly not going to affect an in-place tenant, because we're about to hear this afternoon about everyone's expenses are going up and they can't afford a rent increase. But this would be on a new apartment with hopefully a little bit of that vacancy bump being able to be put back in to the unit.
I think it's a great idea. My only concern is whether the board is permitted to do that.
Yeah, I don't think that we are.
We
yeah.
can't. It's not in our mandate, but it's something that, if we look at the chart since 1969, it's been something that has ebbed and flowed and entered the conversation. That's the point.
Absolutely. And I think 1997 or 1994 was when the vacancy allowance was put into statute. And the years before that, there was definitely, and you could see it on the RGB order historical table, the different years they used the vacancy allowances.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about this. So my understanding was the HSTPA restricted the board from itself making vacancy adjustments as well.
Yeah.
Did, but if it's in the conversation, it might be something that we could bring to the legislature at some point.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's unfortunate that is not permissible anymore, because that was the way you kind of put sand back in the top of the glass, right? On vacancy, you kind of recycled it back so you could start at a higher base. And as we mentioned, the guidelines would slowly let sand drip out over the tenancy. So there would be no real significant increase on existing tenants, but the building revenues would be able to catch up on a vacancy. That was all changed in 2019, and that's why every year since 2019 we come back to this board and say there are no other avenues other than this board. That's unfortunately what the state did, and they put this responsibility on the board members to make sure that the buildings are maintained without allowing any other real avenues to adjust. It's only this board, and that's why that's what we've been saying. You see it in the data now, that the fact that the board hasn't really adjusted its practices from pre-2019, it's creating significant drops in NOI. It's creating significant distress, and the sand is running out of the hourglass.
And just to build upon that, though, the one thing the HSDPA said is you couldn't do for vacancy. We know that. But it didn't limit. You can do anything else you want. You have the power to make any other changes. It's just you can't do vacancy. So there is an ability to be creative and not to follow the patterns of past years. It's just a matter of deciding what you want to do. You actually have everything in the world available to you, except for that one thing. So I think it's incumbent upon everyone to become more creative in how we're going to solve these problems right now. And there's an ability to. There's no restrictions, except for one thing.
I recall, I forgot what year it is, but I remember testifying where there was a minimum increase for rents under, I think, $1,000 or $500, in addition to the percentage increase. So if your rent was, say, $600, you had a minimum $50 increase. So that's something you guys might want to consider this year for those of us who can't make it work, make the numbers work.
Thank you.
I agree with you. Again, it's not allowed. They took that out. You cannot increase. You cannot have a separate guideline based on the length of time the unit has been occupied, the level of the rent, and nothing additional for vacancy.
I love that you brought the hourglass, because I feel like we're all using this analogy now. But the one thing I do want to caution the board, though, is there was a lot of hay made about the IAI increase, and it was supposed to be a huge assist for property owners. But I also just want to be brutally honest. I mean, this is a maximum of $50,000 under two conditions. The tenant was there for 25 years or more, and they left on their own accord, of course, or the unit was vacant for at least 3 successive years. $50,000, I mean, legislators who did their own renovations were joking, maybe that gets me a new bathroom and a new kitchen. Forget about making things lead safe, lead abatement, just electrical code upgrades. I mean, just basic items. And if you don't trust you shouldn't take what we say at face value. DHCR puts out their own cost schedule of what things cost in terms of what it should cost to renovate basic items throughout a unit. And even under their own data of what they allow, we're talking about renovations that easily need to be upwards of $100,000 or more. And so that being said, there's not that opportunity to add sand with this new IAI program that was put forward on the state by the state. And unfortunately, that makes your jobs a lot harder because those tools aren't there, and that's why these rent increases are incredibly important, not just for the unit itself, but the building holistically.
Yes, Hennessy's.
Do you have any data about the expenses that were made or have been made in apartments where tenants have been living there for over 25 years? Expenses for repairs and improvements.
I mean, for individual, an apartment that's still occupied, you mean?
Yeah. Or that was occupied before the tenant left, a tenant who was there for, let's say, over 20 years.
So you mean improvements that we would have done to the apartment while the tenant was still in occupancy? Yeah, I mean, most of the rent-stabilized apartments typically do get renovated when they turn over. But, you know, we've done, I know, like last year, we started upgrading some of the old, you know, because they still had fuses in some apartments, so upgrading the boxes. So we do, so, you know, something like that was $2,500 in a couple of rent-stabilized apartments. You know, in the past, we've had, you know, replace, you know, kitchen cabinets or a countertop, you know, that needed to be done. I think the most recent one I recall was probably about $3,800, you know, replacing some cabinetry. But, I mean, that's just off the top of my head. Like, I can't, but we typically don't do any major renovations. But, you know, I also have tenants that are, you know, mostly single occupants. You know, they're not, I guess, you know, trashing the place, for lack of a better word, or just using it hard, you know? And a lot of them don't live with us full-time either. They have, you know, homes in other places, so, you know, it's, if they're only living there 7 to 9 months of the year.
I think it's important to know that, you know, the main reason why some landlords have to spend so much money in renovating is because there has been no major renovations for over 25 years in most of these apartments. And it's not because the tenant did not want the renovations or that they refuse or because they don't live there, because the majority of the tenants have these apartments as their primary residence, but it's because the landlords have refused to do any repairs. That's why the numbers of complaints, of the DACR numbers of rent reductions complaint is extremely high.
Right.
Where tenants have to wait about over a year, according to the ACR data and some reports, tenants wait over a year to get a small rent reduction. Also, on the IAI, I think, not that I think, one of the reasons it was so easy to pass the law in 2019 to reduce the cap is because about 40% of the cases where a landlord filed an ACI, landlords had no evidence of improvements, 40% of the cases. And those are only the cases that were investigated, because ACR didn't have any requirements on that. Now in 2019, after 2019, landlords were required to provide evidence of improvements. And like you said, 3,800, the cap before 2019 was maximum 15,000. So that's way more than 38 per unit. And it's an amount that the tenant had to carry. It's not a charge basically for the landlord. I think it's important to really point that out.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, you know, I think, you know, Sharon and I our families, right, have been at this a long time. I have never, in all the years, you know, it's 20-plus years I've been helping my mother-in-law, ever denied a request from a tenant to repair something. So, you know, unfortunately, you know, I can't make every other operator operate that way. But, you know, in the case of the apartment that I just talked about that was occupied, right, for over 50 years, the woman lived in a hoarding condition. She didn't allow us access to the apartment. And, you know, the condition that the apartment was in when she died, you know, I spent one time crying in the apartment. Like, I was so overwhelmed by what she left behind. And you know, it was just beyond my control. I mean, and I used to sometimes stand in that apartment and talk to her and behave like as if this was normal. And I knew, like, this is not a safe place for this woman to be. But, you know, that was, again, beyond my control. And had we had reasonable access, you know, probably the $18,000 electric bill that we will have to endure to upgrade that electric, right, would have been done, right? Like I did with the more recently, updating, you know, because it was minimum interruption to them. They were, and, you know, nobody was complaining. I mean, their electric was working, but, you know, I thought about an insurance inspection sometimes saying, you know, hey, this probably isn't the best service to have at this point. So we're doing it proactively.
Yeah, I agree. I see in many of those cases of hoarding, but unfortunately, that makes up about 33% of the cases where
Yeah, but I have
no
two
repairs.
of them, so I wonder, you know.
No, in your case is
Yeah,
high. It is
yeah,
high, and
yeah.
I feel for you.
Yeah.
I feel for you, but that's only about 3% of the cases. And I forgot which one of you mentioned, there's a decline of 70% of II. There was a 70% decline of II claims after 2019. And I think it's also important to point out that the II prior to 2019 resulted in about 70, according to the Association of Neighborhood Improvement, resulted in 76% of destabilization of rent-stabilized apartments, because prior to 2019, IIs allow for the apartments rents to be increased. Therefore, a lot of the apartments were able to be taken out of rent stabilization when they reached about $2,700, right? So 76% of those apartments was taken out. So it's a high number, and that's why IIs were the cap at $15,000, even though most landlords don't spend $15,000 a year per unit in repairs and improvements, and without any evidence. So I think $50,000 is way than enough for improvement in the new law. So I hope that, you know, which is a charge to be given to tenants, because now tenants will have to pay about $80 per unit. I forgot the amount. So we are going to be paying for that.
Right, the 50,000 number, you know, New York is such an expensive place to do anything, right? Every contractor, right there, like we were talking about our insurance burden, like the contractors, right? They have a tremendous amount of insurance burden too, right? So that's built into their cost. So $50,000 of, like, hey, $50,000, right? You should be able to see, right? New fixtures, right, in the bathroom and the kitchen, but you know what they're baking into the price so that they can make money is, you know, so much a part of that $50,000. Like, it's hard to, you know, a lot of it's, you know,
Yeah.
money
You
that
think
you
it's
never.
a lot of money, but then
Yeah.
if you go to the contractor,
No, it's not a lot of money when you have not been making repairs for 25 years, of course. $50,000 is nothing. You have to pay $300,000. $50,000 is nothing.
But there's a lot of new
there has been
mandates.
20-something years of profit without repairs, so that's the problem. I don't think tenants should be carrying the cost of
And
that.
that's a fair assessment, but a lot of us have made repairs throughout the years, but someone's been in place for 20, 35 years. A lot of times they don't want to move their stuff to have it painted, or, you know, we do replace kitchen cabinets and we could do upgrades as we can, but at the same time, when the rents can't carry the cost of it, it's difficult for us to make that decision. And presently, when the city's saying NYCHA needs $300,000 to renovate an apartment, I think it's insulting, insulting to us to offer us 15% and say that's fine.
Yeah,
The numbers have to make sense. Even if NYCHA numbers are inflated, the numbers need to make sense on both ends.
yeah.
And I think we're more focused on IEIs for vacant units at this point, because the housing supply is diminishing, because we cannot renovate these vacant units. And if it's vacant, no one's feeling the immediate effects of the increase, because there's nobody in place. I have tenants, most of my tenants, despite what Joe said, I think he said the average residency was 10 years, mine is 30.
42.
My tenants have watched me grow up, and now I'm watching their grandkids grow up. So when they die or retire or leave the country or whatever it is, it's a lot of work to be done.
Of course.
You know, I paint it and give it to somebody else, but nobody wants 1984 cabinets,
Of course not.
right? And nobody wants a white refrigerator.
And the other part is paying for that, right? So if you wanted to take financing out for doing those renovations, because of what they see in the NOI and because of the increases they see in the payback period, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to even get that financing if you wanted to do it, if you don't already have a loan on the property.
Thank you. Adon?
I was just going to quickly say that I think it would be beneficial for us to have the actual changes to the law in the form of a memo or something like that. I know you'll hear more. I know you'll have more about it in the afternoon. You'll hear more about it, I'm sure, in the news and the media, because I do think that the devil's in the details. One thing that was absent from this part of the conversation was the fact that now the IAI is permanent, right? It's no longer temporary for a period of time, right? So, but again, it's just important that we all have the actual letter of the law and an understanding of what that means. Yeah, you know, I'll leave my remarks.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you, Don. Good. All right, any other comments or questions? Well, I want to thank you all. Oh, please, Reggie.
I was joking with Joe and Kelly. I was like, I don't want this to be the IAI board hearing. But, you know, and I appreciate what you said, Genesis, in terms of like making sure there are guardrails, right? Because there are bottom feeder property owners who were driving out tenants with these renovations, right? And construction by harassment has no place in New York City, nowhere else, period, but especially in our city. We agree with you on that. You know, just some small clarifications, though. You mentioned that 40% of the audit that DHCR had done, that wasn't 40% of all the IAIs. What they did was they took a subset of ones that they thought were fraudulent. They put those ones to the side, and they found 40%, which is, like, it's good that DHCR is doing what they need to do, and they should go after every single one. But I just want to clarify that because I don't want to give this widespread impression that 40% of all IIs that were ever done were found to be fraudulent, because that would be a black eye, I think, on all of us at the table. Sorry, just and the other thing I just want to note again is, you know, I appreciate what you said about
Sorry, I
permanent.
was citing
Yeah, please.
a report by the Association of Neighborhood.
Neighbor housing, yeah.
Yeah, and that's 40% of the IIs.
Yeah, and
Not
unfortunately,
Of the
their-
audited
their-
IAIs.
Their report was a little misleading because it was the audited IAIs and
Yeah.
not the total. So I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page
It was
about that.
literally 1% of the audited IAIs.
Exactly, yeah, so it was less than 1%. Thank you, Christina. You know, the other note, I appreciated what you mentioned about the permanency of this, right? Because, listen, the law was signed into law Saturday night, and we have attorneys throughout the real estate industry who can't even agree with one another about what these statutes mean. So, you know, just to be totally honest about this. So, on the permanency part, that was a huge part of the law, because otherwise, it was going to be impossible to even utilize, because oftentimes banks are not going to lend to the property if they don't know that is going to be permanent. Because when a bank lends to a building, they're not lending to Unit 4C at 90 John Street. They're lending to 99 John as a whole. And so that was one of the pressures. That being said, the amortization rate on the total IAI was barely changed. And that actually only further leads into whether or not property owners are making the decision whether to avail themselves of the IA program at all. And so, you know, I do want to again caution, I just want to underscore, yes, the state legislature did pass a law to change these IAIs, but we think this will have a minuscule bearing in terms of whether these play out. And it really again comes down to sort of the decisions you make on what percentage increase is appropriate. That's really going to be the driving factor about whether or not these buildings remain solvent, and not this IAI program that we don't think is going to be widely used.
Thank you. All right, well, again, thank you all for taking the time. We really appreciate it. It's very helpful to our work. Thank you so much.
I'm just asking.
Okay, so we're going to take a break now because we don't have any other business at the moment. So we'll take a break. Well, we're trying to figure that out. Yeah. Yep.